Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Ice Cold Takes podcast. I'm your host, Joey DeMeglio, and this week I'm joined by the HockeyStatMiner from Twitter. If you don't have a Twitter account, first of all, go make one. And second of all, he's an expert on the salary cap and the CBA, and he's here to help me break down the moves the Rangers need to make this offseason and the Pierre-Luc Dubois trade rumors that surfaced on Wednesday. Thanks for joining me. How are you?
Hey, nice to be here. How's it going?
Pretty good, pretty good. So I mean, usually when I start with these interviews, I always ask, how did you get started? Obviously, we like people don't know exactly who you are, but I mean, that profile picture to me is iconic with the Al Trout wig and the heat map on Twitter. So
Yeah,
how
I'm
did
pretty proud of that one.
so you had to have made that, right? What was that in like Google Drawings or something, or did you Photoshop
Oh
it?
gosh, no, I was probably so loaded when I made it. I have no idea, but it stuck. So there you go.
Yeah. So I mean, how did like what made you start following the salary cap so closely?
Um, well, I guess just it's my personality that like I'm good with numbers, good with economics. Um, so once the salary cap started, there was really like it was kind of unknown to a lot of fans when it really first started. But then you had kind of a learning process start on the internet, kind of like paralleling analytics. There was a wonderful site called CapGeek in the late 2000s that was around up until about I don't know 8 years ago. And then now obviously we have Cap Friendly, who are amazing, Puckpedia. So it kind of grew that there was this way to learn about it, and it just suited my nature. I just found it fascinating because it helped you kind of figure out what was going on, or it helped you learn really why things were happening in the NHL. For example, if you know nothing about the salary cap, why in the world would Arizona trade for Chris Pronger's unofficially retired contract? That doesn't make any sense. But then once you kind of get a sense of the salary cap and learn the incentives and how things kind of work, it's like, oh, that makes perfect sense. So I think it's like a puzzle that's always going on, and I like puzzles. So it just suits me. You know, I it came around where you could learn about it yourself from other people, and here we are 10 years later, and I guess I'm the cap guy now. So there it is.
Yeah, I mean, I like to go on that cap friendly and use that armchair GM stuff all the time. I came up with one like the other day where I had like Paul Stasny on there. You could do whatever you want on there without. It's kind of like a simulator, almost like the EA Sports games, but instead of spending $60 for a crappy game, you could just do it for free.
Yeah, it's fun. I mean, I think if you're a diehard fan, you like to put yourself in that position. Like, okay, what are my options? What can I do? What can I do? Um, how is this going to affect my team? And this time of the year, everyone's asking, kind of, okay, what can the Rangers do? What can't they do? What are their limitations? So just the more you learn about how the salary cap works, how the collective bargaining agreement works, you can kind of start filling in some holes. And you can't predict the future, but you can maybe see things coming or rule things out. And it just makes it kind of it makes being a fan that much more richer, I guess, in a nerdy sort of way.
Gotcha. And in terms of the Rangers, obviously there's a lot of questions that need to be answered from front office standpoint for this season and for next year. It's a tight salary cap. They still need to re-sign Capo Caco, and to me, I think Tyler Mott is deserving to be in that group of people players that needs to be re-signed. Obviously, we already have Kravtsov and Sammy Blais are already on new contracts, but there's still some holes that need to be filled. And my first question for you is: there any way to make a big move with how tight the salary cap is?
Yeah, so it kind of depends on what assumptions like you make about the little things, like how much they spend on a backup goalie. Um, you know, they're probably going to find a way to get a Nemeth. Can they trade him? Do they buy him out? Do they bury him? There's kind of different ways of dealing with that salary. But generally speaking, I think like the good number is probably about $7.5 million they have to spend on Kako, a backup goalie, and maybe like some top nine forward, probably a center, if not Mott. And that's generally, like, if you make some baseline assumptions, that's probably where they're at. I tend to think Kako is going to go the way of Hedel, where it's like the deal Hedel got last year was 2 years at 2.3 each. Kako's, what he's done in his entry-level contract at a glance is pretty similar to Hedel. If you look at like points per game or that type of thing. And backup goalie, it's kind of a question mark. I tend to think Georgiev's played his last game, $1 million if you want to just guesstimate, maybe a little more, maybe a little less. So between that, it's like maybe $4 or $4.5 million they have to spend on that kind of quote unquote last spot. But it's tight. It's very tight, and it's going to be tighter next summer. That's kind of the big thing for me is, you can justify 4.5. If you get rid of Nemeth, maybe kick it up to 5-ish. But next year it's going to be even tighter. So any commitment you're making with that $4 to $5 million, next year there's going to be a whole series of implications when Miller, Laff, Hedel, Kravtsov, if he's still here, all those guys are going to probably be due pay raises, and you're going to be looking at even less maneuverability. So it's kind of a two-dimensional thing. There's this off season and there's next off season, and things you do now that will bleed over next year are going to immediately impact the freedom you have to bridge guys like Miller or Laff or Hedel, whoever, or maybe give them long-term deals. So it's a very fine balancing act that Drury is going to be faced with this summer. But I'd say that number is probably 4.5, maybe pushed up to 5 if you can get out of Nemeth. Generally speaking, that's kind of the baseline.
And that number with moving Nemeth off, is that including his replacement?
It really depends. Like, do you get rid of Nemeth and then is one of Jones or Lundqvist? Do you do someone cheaper, a couple $100,000 cheaper? It really depends how you move Nemeth, because if you can get a whole team to take his whole salary, that's one thing. Yeah, maybe you have to trade and retain half. If you bury him, that's about half. So it depends how you get rid of Nemeth to really kind of figure out what that number is going to be. But I'd say generally $7.5 million for 3 spots, and then maybe if you think of Kako and backup goalie and kind of Nemeth 2.0, whatever, probably in the 4 to 4.5 range.
See, I'm hearing all of this, and now I'm like starting to say, how is it possible the Rangers could possibly make a move for a big name player like a Yanni Gourde, or the rumors today were Pierre-Luc Dubois to the Rangers, and people are theorizing, maybe Kako goes back the other way, but it's got to be significant salary that's going back the other way. If you're going to trade Kako, wouldn't you want to have Pierre-Luc Dubois locked up for the long term? And wouldn't you be making like a commitment of north of $7 million a year?
Yeah, so I have missed largely all the events today. I picked a hell of a day to not be around. But the kind of brass tacks are Dubois. He's gone on record and said, he wants to test unrestricted free agency. I believe he's 3 seasons away from that. He's an outgoing restricted free agent. He has arbitration rights. His qualifying offer is like $6.5 million, I think. And he had a really good year production-wise. So if the Rangers were to go get him, first of all, what does he cost? And I think, Kako's kind of a natural answer to throw in there. It could be anyone, though. It could be Laff, could be Miller, could be Linger. Who the hell knows? It's going to cost something. Winnipeg's not going to trade him for nothing. But I think kind of in this situation, it's really like wonky to try and peg. It always seems with centers, it's really hard to peg what their true value is. You could think of the Eichel packages that everyone was talking about, and then what he actually went for. Not that he went for nothing, but it's hard to really peg. But with a guy like Dubois in his situation, it's kind of like Trouba. It's kind of like he's sort of in this no man's land where he's going to cost a lot, but his future is uncertain. And if you're trading him kind of as is, like, here, you figure it out, that's one thing. But if you trade for him and you've negotiated an extension, if it's kind of like a trade in time deal, like Trouba was, that might change the value as far as a team knowing exactly what's going on and knowing what his number is going forward. But yeah, for the Rangers to acquire him, it's going to cost a lot, but it's not going to be that $4 or $5 million cap space figure because they're going to be presumably giving up something. So if you trade Kakko and a bunch of non-roster prospects, let's just say, then you don't have to pay Kakko. So that 4 to 5 figure probably goes up to like 6 or 7, and that's probably going to be more or less in his wheelhouse. But so much of this depends on, can they find a suitor who negotiates an extension before or after the trade? Are they going to trade him as is, or they could just sign him to a 1-year deal in arbitration and then play this whole thing out next year? That's what happened with Trouba in Winnipeg. He went to 1-year deals, and it was just kind of every summer it was kind of like, oh, is he going to get traded? So it's a huge question mark in so many ways, but it's not impossible that the Rangers would trade for Dubois.
So it's probably be better for them to actually trade for his rights and then negotiate a deal, so that way you're clearing salary rather than wait for restricted free agency and offer sheet him.
I don't think the Rangers can offer. Can they? Oh yeah, I guess they can.
They can't because I don't think they can because they don't have their 3rd-round pick next year. They traded it for Justin Braun. But if they did have that.
Oh, okay. Yeah. Well, first of all, offer sheets, I'm kind of like, I love hypotheticals as much as the next guy, but I'm pretty cold on offer sheets because, like, unless it's Carolina and Montreal, like, prick waving at each other, they just don't happen. So, whatever. But yeah, I think it's really kind of a thing of if you can get term on him and know exactly what that is, that's huge. And it depends what it is, what you give up. But as opposed to inheriting something where it's like, you don't know what he's going to cost. And this is a team, the Rangers, it behooves them to know what everyone's going to cost as soon as possible so they can make moves. Because, let's just say they get Dubois and they don't have something negotiated. He can go to arbitration, which will be anywhere from mid-July to late July, or I guess like late July to early August, because the things are pushed back a couple weeks this year. So how do you square that with free agency moves on July 13th? There's a logistical thing here where it's, if Drury's really going to do stuff in free agency this year, which is a big if, having someone like Dubois not tied down, not knowing that information on free agent day, that's a huge problem. And so I tend to think, and just for Winnipeg's sake, for getting maximum return, you'd think if they're going to trade him, they would let him negotiate an extension somewhere else and get some sort of much more better return for him. But it's so messy. It's so hard to know what the trade would be, what kind of term he wants, if he's willing to sign a long extension and not go to UFA. It's one of those things where it's like there's so much unknown. It's hard to really tie down anything.
Right, and these rumors are kind of like brand new too, so it is difficult since the Rangers kind of play everything close to the vest. Maybe they got that news from Winnipeg side of it, and they broke it like that. But I'm interested to see like what happens, like you said, with free agency. Is it better to stick with like a lower tier acquisition instead of like the big name players like a Scheifele or Dubois or Dylan Larkin? Like stick with a guy like Paul Stastny instead of Andrew Kopp, Ryan Strome, or Vinny Trocheck. What would Stastny do? Would that be kind of like your top 9 acquisition that you were hinting at in the beginning?
Right. Yeah. So Stastny really sticks out. Like, even like, forget what you think about him as a hockey player or whatever. Just purely as an asset, I think he checks a lot of boxes for the Rangers because, you talk about Kopp, Strome, Trocheck, whoever. These are guys that probably are going to go in the $6 to $7 million range, something like that, if free agency is taught. I think the evolving hockey projection has them in the 6 to 7 range, 4+ years, whatever. That's a lot for the Rangers to add, again, because they are just So I called the Big Six. It's Panarin, Kreider, Zibanejad, Trouba, Fox, Igor. Those are six guys that combined for 50 million, which is about 60% of the salary cap, and they're not going anywhere for
Mm-hmm.
another at least 2 years. So if you want to add Trocheck, Kopp, Strome, whoever to that and make it the big seven, this team has just kind of set itself up so that there's a lot of money tied up in not a lot of guys, and it's not exactly easy to cut salary anytime soon.
Mm-hmm.
You could get into like Goodrow maybe, or like Lindgren maybe, if you really need to cut salary in the next. But those are like not the greatest options for doing
No,
that.
they're kind of cheap contract. Lindgren's contract is
Right.
exceptionally cheap.
That's the thing. That's kind of like the canary in the coal mine. It's if you which Ranger has the highest salary cap who has no clauses, none of the restrictive clauses. It's Lindgren, and he's only
Right.
making $3 million. So that's kind of the identity of this roster makeup. So if you want to add a big guy, you can do that, but just know that it's going to be hard to cut salary, and that doing that this summer will directly eat at your options to say sign Miller long term, sign Hedel long term, Kravtsov, Lafreniere. So you almost have to play this summer like you're looking at next summer too, because you are. That being said, Stastny really checks a lot of boxes because he's 36, 37,
I believe
and I think it's a
36,
lot
yes.
more realistic. Yeah, 36. Okay, it's a lot more realistic that he signed something short term. So I wouldn't bet on the Rangers signing Kopp, Trocheck, Strome, whoever, for a 1-year deal or a 2-year deal. I think with Stastny, that's actually a possibility. I think Evolving Hockey has him most likely signing like a 1-year deal for $3 or $4 million. So I think just purely as an asset, purely looking at the layout of what they can do under the salary cap, I think that makes a lot of sense. Personally, I kind of see Stastny as kind of like a very good fit for what the Rangers can do and what they can't do.
I believe Stasny's last contract was 3.75 million, so somewhere around that maybe is what it would cost. And to me, I think a fair. I think that's a good move for the Rangers because he's cheap. You only sign him for 1 year, effective third line center, and I mean, most fans would disagree with me and say, Hedel's not ready to play top six. He's not ready to play second line center. But I mean, if he's all you have and you can't afford to make a long term commitment to Copper, Strome, or Vinny Trocheck, or even Dubois, I say go with Paul Stastny just for this year, just this coming year, and then reassess next year. See how well Lafreniere, Miller, and company perform before you hand out those contracts, and then move that, because what we have here is the core. What the Rangers have here is the core, and front office has expressed multiple times that they are pleased with what they have here, and they want to see Lafreniere and Kakko get top 6 minutes next year. So I think it's time for them to prove themselves. At least have 1 year to where they have the top six to themselves, not have to worry about a guy like Vetrano or Dryden Hunt or Colin Blackwell take their ice time. Like that's happened in years past. Would you agree with that?
Yeah, a really good follower on Twitter is Josh Kalfin, and he wrote he wrote an article on Substack like a week ago or so, and he put it so well. He said, if you're not at least willing to roll the dice on Hedel, Laff, Kakko next year, like what was the rebuild for? You went into the rebuild, live and die with it, and now we're at the end of it, live and die with it. So I'm much more kind of like roll the dice, whatever. But I would also say that there's it's a very fine line. You kind of look at a roster and what fits under the salary cap, and then you get into, first line this, second line this, third line this. I kind of look at it more as like a grouping. You want the best group possible, and whether, let's just say the Rangers get Stastny, is Hedel going to be the number 2 or is he be the number 3? Stastny, For me, it's almost like it doesn't matter, because no matter what, the Rangers have so much money to spend, and they're going to want to spend it as best they can. And whether that's Hedel as a 2, Hedel as a 3, it almost doesn't matter because it's like the depth in the abstract, the depth is really kind of the thing. And kind of one thing I always see is, there's injuries during the season. Like some people, be like, oh, there's 4 right wingers, why would you sign a 5th? And it's like, well, there's injuries during the season, like in the postseason for that matter. And so you just want to get like the best group in general all together. During the season, Strome was hurt, Kako was hurt. So like, it almost doesn't matter who's the 2 or the 3. It's almost like at some point you're going to be asked to be the 2 or the 3, depending on who's healthy. So it doesn't matter. Like whether Drury sees Hedel as a 2 or a 3, it's almost like it doesn't matter because he's going to spend whatever money he can to improve center in either event. So, I don't get really bogged down in the Hedel 2-3 position. I think it's more just what can Drury add to center for the lowest possible price, because he's going to do that anyways, no matter what he thinks of Hedel.
So Stastny would probably be a good choice, especially with a weaker free agency class. I mean, there's big names out there like Malkin or Bergeron, Trocheck even, but they're going to be way too expensive for the Rangers' price range in terms of the cap hit. And is there any indication of like, is the maximum going to increase significantly anytime in the near future, or is that all dependent on how well the NHL does, like with revenue?
Yeah. So just kind of a basic primer. The cap should have gone down a lot in the 21 season. It should have gone down like by half, but that just wouldn't work. Like how the hell can the salary cap go from 80 million to 40 million or whatever it was? So they kept it up at where it is artificially, but that represents a debt. It's like a line of credit. So when people see there's like these crazy revenues with ESPN now, and they wonder why the salary cap isn't tethered to that, it's because they have to pay off that debt, that lag from the COVID season.
Oh, so they're like negative, and now they have to get back to zero, kind of.
Right, and they're paying off profits, not revenue. So, and it was about $1 billion lag is the general figure. So as far as I'm aware, they're hoping that by the summer of 2026, it'll go back to normal. So for the next 3 or 4 years, it's going to be $1 million increases no matter what's going on with revenue. And that's, kind of assuming revenue keeps coming in. The cap exploding to 100 million or whatever, that's not going to happen in the next 2 years, certainly. Probably not until like 3 or 4 years from now. So that's the whole story with that. You see a lot of people with that, which sucks for the Rangers because they're one of those teams that they would gladly spend 100 million on a team, but no, we're going to be paying off that COVID lag for another couple of years at least.
So there's not going to be like an outside help, like, oh look, this year we have a significant increase in cap. That was. It's a bit disappointing. I remember right before COVID happened, it was like projected the cap was about to go up by like what was it, $2.5 million? Like it was to like 83 something.
Yeah, I mean that's kind of if COVID didn't happen, we'd
Right.
probably be well into the 80s by now. You would think, but who knows? But yeah, it's unfortunate. It just kind of sucks that when the cap was created and its relationship to revenue, it didn't much. Much like most of the economy, it didn't really factor in some sort of massive shock to like COVID did. So, but yeah, I the number that I've seen is like we're still 3 or 4 years away from getting back to normal. And will the cap jump up a lot 3 or 4 years from now? We'll see. I mean, you can never really know this far out, but certainly not in the next few years because they're paying off like $1 billion debt, and that's not going away anytime soon.
Understood. And getting back to the Rangers in terms of what they need to address for this coming season, 6th, 7th D for them. I mean, we had Braun, and then there's Nemeth, who we just talked about, saying that he's most likely to be traded. I'm sure the jury's trying to find a way to ship out that contract. Hindsight, he probably wouldn't have wanted to sign that one if he got a second chance, but mistakes happen. But who would you say has like the best chance to come back and play like that in that spot? Would it be Braun, do they go have like an internal competition with Zach Jones or Nils Lundqvist?
Yeah, so like kind of the Lundqvist Jones thing is kind of like this looming question mark. Because in theory you could have one of those two, like pair with Schneider, and be the third pair guy, replace Nemeth. You could have maybe both of them. Maybe you could have, one is a 6, one is a 7, and then again, like I'm saying, with the reality of injuries, like if one defenseman is hurt at any time, they're both in the top 6. But you could also have both in Hartford. You could trade one or both this off season. As far as replacements go, I'm of the opinion that there's going to be plenty of options for like left side defensemen on the free agent market. If you're talking about a third pair guy or an extra guy, so I think it's pretty kind of like, I don't know, it's kind of like an extra forward. Like it's like there's going to be your pick, and it's not going to cost a lot. So I don't have any strong opinions on that. I'll see what Drury does, and then I'll have a strong opinion. But I think one of the things about Jones Lundqvist is like they're perfect trade bait this summer because they're kind of frozen out of they're like the forgotten children of the rebuild because they kind of have hit as prospects, but there's no room for them. Rangers have 5 of their 6 spots locked up. But on the other hand, they can both play in Hartford next year and be like called up freely and sent down freely. So there's no rush. It's not like, October they're going to be waivers. They're going to be subject to waivers, and so you can't put them in Hartford. So you got to do something. They have one more year where it's like they can kind of nest them if they want. But at the same time, it's like if you're going to be trading for a Dubois or a Gord or a Scheifele, those are like the first names you think of. So trading from defense is their strength. You trade from strength to address weakness. So that makes sense. So those guys are a huge question mark. And then leading to your point, what's the 6th, 7th ski spots going to look like? Probably a lot of it depends on if Lundqvist and Jones are still here in October. But if not, I mean, there's no shortage of third pair guys that you could sign to a 1-year deal for very cheap. So I don't have a strong opinion on it necessarily, but I think the Jones Lundqvist thing is kind of like, okay, if they're going to get traded, then you go to the market. But if not, they could both make it for all we know. So.
Right, and I mean Brendan Smith went this year for less than $1 million to Carolina, and he played really well over there, and I liked him as a defenseman on the Rangers, and then also there's the backup goalie spot that needs to be addressed, and I feel that you want to go cheap there. I think Georgiev's qualifying offer was like around $2.5 million. Correct me if I'm wrong.
Yep.
Yeah, so around there, and I mean, to you and me both, we don't think that he's coming back next season for the Rangers. And, I think a guy, an experienced veteran, maybe a guy like Yaroslav Halak would be a good fit there for just to have someone back there for Shesterkin. He's not going to be getting a whole lot of games anyways. I'd say Shesterkin's starting north of 60 games this season, especially after the insane season he had this year. Vezina Trophy, it was historic. It was I don't even know what other words to describe it. Help me out here.
Fucking great. That's what it was.
Yeah. I saw you posted a bunch of like historical stats, like in comparison to Dominic Hasek. And anytime you have like a goalie's name in comparison to Dominic Hasek, like that's automatically just an incredible thing. Unless you're talking about a negative stat, but like, did Hasek even have any negative stats? Like the guy was amazing.
Right, yeah. The stat was, I looked at kind of the most, unanimous voting for a Vezina.
There you go.
And it's, he got 90, like a little more than 96% of the votes. And if you kind of weigh it for the first, second, third voting system. And, he's way up there. Hasek's up there. Price is up there. It's kind of, it's a little disappointing he didn't give McDavid a run for that second place in the Hart. But
right.
What are you gonna do?
Yeah, and I mean his I think that stat you mentioned was when Hasek won the Hart Trophy, his average, his save percentage was how much better than the next closest guy? in his year.
Yeah, Hasek was insane. Every 2 weeks, I'll see something where it's like, who's like the best goalie of these bunch, and it's like, look, Hasek's the best, and like everyone else is fight. You can pit Waugh against Brodeur against whoever. Hasek's number one. I mean, there's like no doubt in my mind whatsoever. Uh, so
That,
like
yeah.
I swear to God, every 2 weeks on Twitter, there's like something like that, and it's just like, oh my gosh, what did this guy have to do to like get his respect?
So for best goalies of all time, is it Hasek Lundqvist?
Uh, it kind of like it gets messy when you like compare eras because there's like a lot of less information back in the day, and
Yeah.
but like Hasek is like, I mean, it, you can't if you just look at his numbers, like what he led the league in, he was putting up stuff that was just insane against his peers. So he's up there. It's a whole conversation about like how would I actually rank all the goalies of all time, but Hasek is like I'd put him at number one for sure. He was just
Well,
insane.
we'll do that. We'll do that for another episode maybe. But getting
That's
back
like a
to
summer project.
yeah, there you
That's like
go.
an
There you
August,
go. And
a
and
dog days of
speaking,
August project.
what was the project that you wanted to work on that you were telling me about with that draft prime, or not the draft primer? That's Drew Way's thing. The salary cap thing. You were telling me something about that.
Oh, I was like creating a model for how how this is like super nerdy, but for one of my courses, I was creating a model for how salary distributions, like the inequality of salary on a team, affects if it wins or loses. And yeah, that was like a whole. That was a that was a stunning failure on my part because it was just like the model sucked and I didn't do things in a very good way, and I had to rush it because the end of the semester came and it was like, ugh. But no, I'm always down for like nerdy anything with the salary cap, anything like trying to create a model or a nerdy projection. I'm all about that.
Got it. Yeah. I mean, I think all the stuff that I've seen you do on Twitter is just comprehensive and in depth and very detailed. So I know there's a lot of people out there, hopefully listening to this, that want to understand the CBA and the salary cap more. And I think having you write stuff like that is, makes it easy for them to follow, especially because you follow the Rangers so closely, and it's relatable too. So, like, because you're a Rangers fan, you could explain it from their perspective, and that a Rangers fan could understand it. So I think that would be extremely beneficial to people that want to follow that.
I appreciate the kind words. No, people taught me, and I think there's like kind of like this thing where it's like not everyone likes math, not everyone likes like the nerdy stuff, and so but they want to know what's going on if you're a fan of the team. So there's kind of this fine line where maybe you can put it in terms like uh, one of my favorite things is like the Rangers ended up having 30 million in salary cap space at the deadline, and it's like how the hell does that work? And it's like, well, if you're a millennial and you remember how rollover cell phone plans worked, it's like the Rangers were not using 7 or 8 minutes each month, and then at the end of the month, or 6 months later, they had 30 minutes that they could use because they were under every month. So just stuff like that. Because people want to know what's, again, like I said earlier, people want to know what's going on, what options their team has, what options their team doesn't have, why is it like this, why did that happen, and there's like this whole nerdy rabbit hole to figuring out why. But for people who aren't sad salary cap nerds like myself, it's always helps. It's helpful to explain kind of maybe how things work the way they work as best you can.
I wanted to move back on to, for next year's salary cap implications. We talked about what's going to
Yep.
happen for Lafreniere, Miller, and Hedel, but I wanted to know what would a future contract look like for them? Like, what's the best way to handle that? Should all of them be given bridge deals, or should they be handled like an investment long term, like the Devils did with Hughes? Like this year, I mean, Hughes proved himself. He had what, like 60 something points this year. Season cut short due to injury, but they signed him to an 8-year extension. It was like $8 million per. Is that something that the Rangers would be looking at, or is it more of a bridge for Lafayette and Miller?
Yeah, so that's a great question. That's kind of where uncertainty plays a huge part. It's like it's not so much you know what's going to happen; it's you don't know what's going to happen, but you kind of it behooves you to be able to deal with it as when it comes. Um, so what Laugh, Miller, Kraftov, uh, Heedle, what they're going to get on their next contract is very much up in the air. There's so many examples you could point to where guys were very much flying below the radar, and then in their contract year they turned it up a huge notch, and they got money that no one would have expected they got. A good example is Nino Niederreiter. When he was with the Islanders, he produced like absolute his production was insanely nothing. He did not score any points. He got traded to Minnesota, and then finally in the last year of his entry level contract, he put up like 30 or 40 points, and then he got a $10 million 3-year deal or something like that. And it's just one of those things where it's like no one would have paid him that if it wasn't for his final deal, the final year of his deal. So who knows if Heedle really is put into like the 2C spot and he scores 40, 50 points, his contract's going to look a lot different than what we're talking about now. Same with Miller, Laugh. So it's very hard to point to what they're going to cost. But I think the moral of the story is if you want to have that option to bridge them or sign them long, if they have a great contract year, if they don't have a great all these kind of unknowns and all the options you have, if you go the route of Kopp, Trocheck, Strome, you are cutting into that arsenal of options next summer because you're going to have less cap space and you're going to have less ability to shed cap or shed salary in order to maybe give someone more term and money than you're pegging them at now. So it's very much you don't know, but you can leave yourself options. So it's a very fine line between how good you want this team to be, or how much can you improve this team this summer without sort of cutting into or eating into those options next summer, because they're all up in the air. I mean, who knows what Miller's going to get next year? Who knows what kind of season he's going to have in 2023? So it's almost like you're juggling this game of imperfect information, and you don't know what's going to happen, but you can sort of set yourself up to be able to deal with more possibilities.
Right. And I mean, I'm looking at Cap Friendly right now, and it says there's about 24.5 million in space next year to sign, Miller, Lafreniere, Heedle, and then there's also, the salary that you're giving to Kako, and if you decide to go long term with anybody, whatever is carried over for the next couple of years. But I mean, of that trio, I'd say Miller is probably the most likely to get a significant pay raise. I think they're all going to get a good amount of money, a salary increase, but Miller might go from, ELC of 925K to 4.5, maybe 5 million, just from his playoff performance alone.
Right.
Because he turned
That's the
some
interesting
heads.
part. Yeah, that's the interesting part. Is you have these kids really show up, and so if they trend that way next season, oh yeah, they're going to cost money.
That's a good thing too. I mean, it's a good problem to have because this is what we wanted to happen. This was the dream. We wanted these guys to succeed.
Right, yeah. Yeah, so you can tie this whole conversation directly to what do they do for center this summer, because it's, unless you're doing Stasny on a 1-year deal, if you're signing or even acquiring someone who's a major contract, you're going to have that amount of money less to do something like that with Miller or Heedle or whoever.
So let me ask you, as a fan of Rangers, what would you like to see them do? Would you like to see them make the trade for Dubois or play it safe and go with Stasny?
I kind of lean towards Stasny.
Yeah, that's what I'm talking about. I like that too.
It's a lot more, I think, low risk. And, well, I mean, there is some risk. His underlyings are actually pretty good. His 5-on-5 recently is, really good. He has a defensive aspect to his game. The only problem is, once you're that long in the tooth, once you're 36, 37, it's not at all insane for you to just fall off a cliff. So there is kind of some risk in that as far as like, can he keep doing what he's done in Winnipeg for the Rangers for 1 year? But on the other hand, it's safe in the sense that, okay, you leave yourself maximum options for how you deal with all of the pay raises that are coming next summer. And, you can kind of, you can leave yourself a lot more room and not necessarily at like the huge detriment. Like, and you asked about Tyler Mott earlier. I didn't even get to it. So let me go all the way around and
Go ahead.
back. There's one theory where, let's just say the Rangers don't do anything. It's like last summer, right? And they have Zibanejad, Hedel, and let's say Goodrow as like their top three centers. Let's just say that like if you want to sign Mott, then you can kind of get into that range. Of course, you're going to do the same problem with presumably he's signing a multi-year deal, so you're going to eat into that next summer options with the kids. But that's probably where unless there's like trading going on or something. But as of right now, that's kind of where you justify Mott or Vetrano, whoever, spending a couple million on a third line wing or whatever you want to call it. And with that, it's kind of like, and this is really kind of where like the salary cap nerdum comes in. If the Rangers don't go out and quote unquote replace Strome or Kopp, and they go with Zibanejad, Hedel, Goodrow, theoretically, if they're like $1 million under the cap the whole season, they'll have like $5-6 million in cap space at the deadline. So like one option in theory is they don't really replace Strome and Kopp. They sort of kind of hold it together within, maybe bring in Mott or Vetrano. And then they do what they did last year. They kind of add that center at the deadline. And then, who knows what Scheifele's deal is going to be, or Gord, whoever, if it's even like a pure rental or if it's like a 1.5-year rental or whatever. So that is kind of like a low-key possibility. We'll see. I mean, there's like, it's funny. They have so little options, or they've like relatively so little cap space, but there's different ways they could do things. They could make a trade with LA for Velarde or Turcotte. They could make it, or Cody Glass from Nashville. Like kind of find another team's center version of Kravtsov and like roll the dice, and maybe that's like a solid 3C that can grow into a role for cheap. I mean, there's like, they have options of what they're going to do. So personally, I don't know exactly what my preference is. I think I would prefer Stastny over, kind of making the big 6 into a big 7, just because you're really going to be pushing it next summer as far as what options you have and what little options you have to shed salary cap space if one of these kids explodes this next season. But it's so, a trade can change things so quickly. So it's very hard to like project what's going to happen. We don't even know how Nemesis is going to play out. There's so many ways he could play out: bury, trade, buyout. I mean, who knows? So it's very messy stuff to be like, what's the ideal thing the Rangers do? Because there's like so many assumptions you have to make.
I like that Stastny's face-off percentage is well over 50% for his career. And this past year, he was 56.6% from the dot. So you could rely on him to take a face-off for you. And that's something that the Rangers haven't had in a long time. And, it frustrates me so much when, you pin the other team in the offensive zone, they take an icing, you get to the dot, and then you lose the face-off clean, and you get nothing, and they clear the puck and get a change, and nothing happened. That kills me as a fan. And, having someone out there just to win you the face-off, I feel like that would just be, like it would mean so much for the team. Even if you don't, score a goal, you're just going to continue to add pressure to the team and put them on their heels. And I think that was a big factor in, why the Rangers weren't able to win 2 more games against Tampa Bay in the playoffs.
Yeah, there's no doubt that winning more faceoffs is better. I tend to kind of fall into the school of, like, if we're talking about like what separates you from, let's say, the conference finals versus being the cup winner, I think it becomes pretty small pretty quickly. Just because if you are the better team, generally speaking, like, you can afford to give faceoffs away. I think there was one stat where like Tampa Bay, one of their cup years, like they did pretty poorly in defensive zone faceoffs. So I think it's almost like it definitely matters, but I think I'm skeptical of how much it really plays into it if you're talking about championship caliber. But yeah, I agree. It's especially with Heedle faceoff numbers, it's kind of if they got Stasny to be kind of this like more defensive oriented / faceoff specialist to complement Heedle, and then you can kind of maybe roll 2 and 3, the second and third lines a little more evenly. I think that's really one thing that I'm not like the biggest coach, put the coach on trial guy, but yeah, but the way it was like the kid line was just so like the third line was so removed from how much time the first and second lines got. If you could maybe bridge that gap and you have a top 9 that you can roll a lot more evenly,
Yeah,
I think that would have made a difference. And if we're really kind of like talking about why the Rangers lost to Tampa, I mean, Tampa's a really good team, but I really think the 20 games and 40 nights killed them. I mean, they were just gassed. Sure. They were just so gassed. You could see it. They were playing hurt.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, there's a reason why, generally speaking, teams don't force a game 7 every round and then win. You know what I mean?
Right. Yeah, and I'll agree with you on that about the 20 games in 40 days. I said it last week when I talked to Vince Mercogliano that that was the biggest factor. But I mean, I just think that the faceoffs have an impact somewhat, even if it's minimal. It's there. I feel like, but you had brought up that if the Rangers go with the center core of Zibanejad, Heedle, and Goudreau for their season with $1 million in cap space, it brings them to the deadline, and they got $6 million in cap space. Does that mean for any player they acquire, is their cap hit less, or is it like the same that it has been all season?
No, it's like that. It's like theoretically that $5 million means you can add like $5 million in cap hit to whatever the guy's number is.
Okay, yeah. So it's I know there's like the effective cap hit, and it's like to that point how much that player has been paid, and then whatever is remaining that goes against your cap. Is that not how it works?
Yeah, that's like this is really where you get into like the nerdy math stuff. But yeah, no, it's generally speaking, if you have $5 million at the deadline in cap space, you can add like a $5 million contract.
Got it.
At that time. That's generally how it works. Yeah.
Okay, and then one last question for you. So I know we talked a lot in the beginning about is it even possible for the Rangers to make a big move over the next 2 years? How would it be? How would it be possible? I mean, I've seen people theorize. Yanni Gourde from Seattle, he got a big contract, but if they retain half the salary, would it work? How real? That's like a completely unrealistic thing. 50 for them to retain 50%, and he's got what 4 or 5 years left on his deal. They just signed it, right? How much would need to go back to make that unrealistic pipe dream come true?
Yeah, so I think I started this, by the way. I definitely floated it 6 months ago. But yeah, he has 3 years left now.
3 years.
And he's getting about $5 million a year in cap hit. So that's like pushing it. Basically, I put it like this. It's if you remember the 2015 Rangers, they had no cap space, but they wanted to add. So what they ended up doing was they acquired Keith Yandel, but Arizona retained 50%, and they had Yandel for 1.5 years. They got him at the 15 deadline, and he was under contract until summer 2016. So that's kind of like the team that wants to win now that doesn't have cap space. That's sort of like an idea where if a team is willing to trade a guy and he has 1 or 2 years left, maybe 3, that's probably pushing it, they will retain. But the only problem is, of course, it's super expensive. I mean, the Rangers gave up Duclair, a first, multiple firsts? I can't remember. John Moore. They gave up a whole lot for Yandel.
Yeah. I was a big fan of that trade. I really love that trade.
Only Yandel got more playing time, right?
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. So that's kind of like another route. I think like Scheifele is kind of maybe one to watch because there's all this noise about he might be done in Winnipeg. Some about Winnipeg and Senators this summer. That's gonna be the team to watch, I guess. But yeah, that's maybe something. And I think it does fit with the Rangers because they have, you can like look past the roster. You could look at all the prospects they have that aren't on the roster that are kind of the product of a multi-year rebuild that like would make great trade fodder. Seattle's kind of interesting in a way because unlike Vegas, they weren't able to like kind of parlay their expansion draft picks into like a pipeline. Like they were able to get Shea Theodore, Alex Tuck, stuff like that. And Seattle was not able to do that. So they're still sort of creating a pipeline from scratch. And so if you do talk about like, Neil Lundqvist or, Zach Jones or like some of these guys that are a couple years removed from their draft year and a little more ahead on the development curve, that is something where maybe Seattle like would tend to value them a little more than all these other teams that have more or less a pre-established pipeline. So that's maybe something, but I wouldn't hold my breath for the Rangers acquiring Gordon for 50%. Like maybe they'll take like a small chunk or something, but yeah, those are ideas where it's like it all depends on what it costs, and you can bet it's going to be goddamn expensive.
Yeah.
So it's a fun thing to float, but it would cost them dearly. There's no doubt about that.
I'd rank in terms of realisticness, realism, whatever. Stastny, the Stastny option where he's third line center or second line center, whatever. Middle six, we'll just say. Top 9. That's number 1. Number 2 would be a Dubois trade, and then number 3, Yanni Gourde at 50% retained salary. I mean, I'd love for that. I think that would be. I'd like that as the best option. I'd rather have Gourde as the third line center and then let Hedl play with Panarin, and let's see what happens, see what he does. It would be fun. That's what it would be. It would be fun for me as a fan. But
so much it comes down to like how much is it going to cost. You know what I mean? It's so wonky. Like who had Trouba going for Neil Pionk? You know what I mean? Like it's so wonky. Or who had Booch going for what he got? So
a second in Blay.
It's just so wonky figuring out like what players the Rangers can get for in a trade. What will it cost them? It's like it's kind of fun maybe to like come up with like a baseline amount, but it's still just it's voodoo. Like, 'cause who knows what these guys are actually going to do.
So thinking back to, you brought up the Trouba for Pionk trade. That summer, I remember everyone was saying, oh, it's going to be Elias Anderson. It's going to be multiple first-round picks. It's going to be this guy and that guy. And then it just happened to be Winnipeg's own first-round pick. And this defenseman that we were going to trade anyways at some point for Trouba. And we thought it was just a damn steal, right? And then now by that logic, all these people are saying, oh, it's going to be Kakko and Kravtsov and First and Nils Lundqvist. And then watch, it's going to be like Zach Jones and Andrew Kopp because they traded Kopp to us at the deadline. So we're just going to give him back.
Yeah, this kind of goes to the Dubois point. It's so hard because there's so much going on behind the scenes. Like one thing with Trouba was he only had like a few cities in mind to sign long term because his wife or his fiance or wife, wanted to do med school, and so there's only 3 bidders instead of 13 bidders, and so the price drives it. Blah blah blah. Same with Dubois. Like he might just be like, look, I'm going to test unrestricted free agency in a couple of years. Although here's 3 places that I'll sign an extension now, and then good luck getting maximum value out of that because less bidders it means lesser price. So it's so wonky to like go into like, okay, what is what player going to go for? Obviously they're skilled. Obviously you can kind of figure out what salary they're going to get, but there's just there's always this stuff where it's like you never know what they're actually going to cost.
If there is a move to be made for Dubois, I hope it's that option where you said, okay, he's waiting for unrestricted free agency. He's only going to go to this place, and this place, and I'll only make an extension with them. So, good luck trading me. If Rangers were gonna in that position, I would hopefully think they lowball them, but give them a good enough offer where it's better than all the other teams without having to give up like Kakko. You know what I mean? If they could make the math work out, I don't know how they would do it, Maybe they put guys like Othman or Will Cooley in there since they're, entry level contracts, but I don't know who that would mean they have to replace. Maybe you go without a guy like Mott, or you scratch Rooney or not Rooney, Reeves. You bury Reeves. I have no idea, but is something like that, like where you use Othman or Cooley to make the math work out, like an option for the Rangers if they want to make like a move for a guy that has a bit of salary, like a significant amount of salary.
Yeah, the problem is it's like we're not counting Cooley or Othman in their pool for next year, so you'd have to remove guys like that we're counting. So Kako's
Mm-hmm.
one, whoever. So that's if because I'm assuming Dubois is going to get what 7, 8, who knows. Um, so that money has to come from somewhere, and you can't really like. There's something to be said about non-roster assets like Cooley, Othman, Lundqvist, Jones being logical parts of a trade package. But ultimately, one way or another, if it's that trade or maybe the Rangers have to make like a cap clearing trade before it, they'd have to cut something somewhere. And like I said, the team is structured where you can't really do that very well or very easily. Like there's Nemeth, Goodrow, Lindgren. Those are like the guys like who would be the cap casualties this summer, and that's not a lot of cap. They're making 2, 3, 3.5 million. So it'd be very hard to do that without Kako or Lindgren or someone going the other way. And that's the cap math. The real thing is Winnipeg can also just keep Dubois, go to arbitration, do a 1-year deal, and then play this out again next summer. I mean, they don't have to trade him. So who knows? It'd be wonderful if the Rangers made a quote unquote good trade and got a quote unquote good player, but who the hell knows?
Yeah, well, so we'll see. We'll see what happens as the off season progresses. We have the draft coming up, and then free agency begins when July 13th.
That's it. Yeah, it's everything's pushed back 2 weeks
So
this year. So
I'm sure
July
you'll be
13th.
all over. I'm sure you'll be all over free agency.
Well, we'll see. It could be very boring for the Rangers, so we'll
Yeah,
see.
for sure. I don't expect them to be going out making batshit crazy moves. The biggest acquisition I could see them making day one is like Paul Stasny, honestly, and
Right. And then when they
I'd
do
be
that,
happy
like they
with
have
that.
nothing left to spend.
Yeah, and then they have
Yeah, I
nothing
mean,
else to spend. Exactly.
so we'll see. I'm interested to see if Kako signs before then because
Yeah.
they'll want to know exactly how much he costs so that they can milk every penny out of what they have remaining for, let's just say, Stasny or whoever. So
Right.
that's a huge thing. It's like, can you sign someone to a $4.5 million deal not knowing what Kako's number is going to be yet? And then, it's a whole thing where it's like how you manage incomplete information. It makes a huge difference in just how like your off-season planning and what you can offer and what you can do at what time. So, but we'll see.
In terms of fireworks moves, I think it's going to be pretty uneventful from the Rangers because they just have to worry about their own players first. Kako being one of them, and then they just have the lower tier positions to fill, like backup goalie, an extra defenseman, and then again a center. A center is probably what they're going to go with, but we'll see. So I mean, from I'd say the draft is going to be pretty uneventful too. I don't see the Rangers trading into the first round. I don't see any need for them to do that. They don't have. I believe they don't have a second round pick this year either. And
They have like the number 63 pick, I think,
number 6. Oh, they do have the second. They do have a second round pick. Okay, so
like
that's
at
going
the
to be all
way
right.
end.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So the second pick, and then we have 1, 2, 3, 4 picks in the last in rounds 4, 5, and 6. 4 picks in 3 rounds there at the end. So we'll see if Drury can make some magic happen with his later picks. Like we've seen the Rangers, it seems like they've been able to do with in recent years with their late round draft picks. We'll see what happens. But anyways, Hockey Stat Miner, thanks so much for joining us. Really appreciate it. We should do it again sometime.
My pleasure. And we'll see how the summer shakes out, huh?